My name's Peter Holland, and I'm Associate Dean for the Arts here at Notre Dame in the College of Arts and Letters. And as I'm sure you know, the College of Arts and Letters is responsible for presenting the Saturday Scholars Series, something we are always very proud to do, to offer you the chance to listen to some of our most distinguished researchers and distinguished teachers, and most importantly of all, those of our colleagues who are both distinguished teachers and at the same time distinguished researchers. Today's speaker is Kristin Valentino, who has what I think may be the longest title for her position that I've come across at Notre Dame. Kristin is the William J. Shaw Center for Children and Families Collegiate Chair and Associate Professor of Psychology, all that in one mouthful. Her BA came from Georgetown University and her PhD from the University of Rochester, and she had a postdoctoral fellowship at the Yale Child Study Center before we prized her away to join the faculty of Notre Dame in 2008. Her research examines how the integration of psychological, biological, and environmental factors can inform our understanding of child development and child psychopathology, with a focus on family processes among maltreated children. And in addition, she's interested in the translation of developmental research into interventions for maltreated children and their caregivers. Professor Valentino's awards include the American Psychological Association section on Child Maltreatment Early Career Award, and her research is currently funded by the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. So, to talk about healing words and healing work, supporting recovery from child abuse and neglect, please welcome Kristin Valentino.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to be talking with you about the problem of child maltreatment, talking about its scope and why it matters. And so when I talk about child maltreatment, I am referring to both child abuse and neglect. And then I'm going to talk about how we're addressing this important issue here at Notre Dame. So first, through my research, and then also through teaching. So child maltreatment, as I mentioned, refers to sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and then both physical and emotional neglect. And in terms of prevalence, we know that nearly 750,000 of children receive a substantiation of child abuse and neglect annually. But that's really an underestimate of the number of children affected by child maltreatment, because we know that about 5 times as many children are actually investigated by the Child Protective Services. And so there's many, many more that are actually experiencing child abuse and neglect than I think our substantiation numbers show. And when we think about who are the perpetrators of this abuse, I think many people would be surprised to realize that most of those perpetrators are actually a parent. So more than 80% of the victims of child maltreatment were abused by either a parent acting alone or with somebody else. And when we think about who are the victims, risk for child maltreatment is the greatest for children under the age of 5. And when you think of certainly the most severe outcome of child maltreatment, which would be fatalities, more than about 80% of the children who die because of child abuse and neglect are under the age of 4. In our community, it's no different, and I wanted to just highlight how prevalent this is. So in Indiana, in 2010, there were 25 child deaths that were associated with child abuse and neglect, and in 2015, that number is up to 77. So this is a pretty significant problem, and one that I don't think really receives enough attention. Thinking about child abuse and neglect often makes people feel somewhat uncomfortable, and I think it's important to think about, when was the last time you really thought about child abuse and neglect? How about when was the last time you viewed a public service announcement addressing child abuse and neglect? So, it might be helpful to just have a raise of hands. How many people in the audience have had or have seen a public service announcement for child abuse and neglect in the last week? How about the last month? What about a PSA for the prevention of animal cruelty? How many people have seen a public service announcement for that in the last week or month? Nearly everybody. Right? So why is that? Why is it that we pay more attention to protecting animals and are able to talk about that more than we're able to talk about protecting children? And it's interesting on a historical note, this precedent for thinking about the protection of animals actually is in our history of child abuse and neglect laws. So in 1874, we had no organized child protection laws, and there was a religious missionary in New York City who knew of a 9-year-old child who was being severely beaten and neglected, and she called the police. And the police told her that there was nothing that could be done. There were no laws that had been broken. And so what she did actually was she sought the help of the head of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And that society's lawyer is the one that was able to get that child removed from their home and really initiated the beginning of organized child protection laws. So we have this longstanding history of really having a hard time thinking about child maltreatment. And I think it's an issue that really deserves much more attention. So you think maybe we don't think about it that much because it's not happening here in Indiana. Well, I showed you the fatality statistics, and actually when you look at the rates of child maltreatment, Indiana is actually one of the worst states in terms of child maltreatment. So we rank 5th in terms of top numbers of child maltreatment per 1,000 children. So about 88 for every 1,000 children are investigated for child abuse and neglect, and our victimization rate, meaning the number of kids who we know their parents had a substantiation against them for child abuse and neglect, it's about double the national average. And I think another scary statistic is looking at the increase of reports and maltreatment between just 2011 and 2015. So there's been a 74% increase in the number of reports. Some of that's good, right? We want people paying more attention, people calling in and making reports if they suspect that there's child abuse or neglect occurring. But just an increased awareness is not alone driving up these numbers. So not only is this a prevalent issue, it's important because trauma has a lasting impact. So when we think about just during the kids who were investigated by Child Protective Services, if we look at those preschoolers who receive an investigation, now I'm not talking about the ones where there was a substantiation, just ones where there was an investigation, nearly 50% of those kids show clinically significant levels of mental health symptoms. And there's a myth that maybe kids just forget about these experiences. They grow out of early childhood trauma and abuse and neglect experiences, but that's really not true. And some of our best evidence against that comes from a very large study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. It was done by the CDC and included nearly 16,000 participants. And so what they did was they looked back at all these adults and asked them, how many of these adverse childhood experiences did you experience? So the list on the left is all child maltreatment: sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional and emotional neglect. And then they also counted some other items they referred to as household dysfunction. So whether there was substance abuse in the family, whether a parent was incarcerated before you were 18, household mental illness, domestic violence, or parental separation or divorce. And even in a really crude way, just like yes or no, did these things happen to you? This study has been super powerful in showing us the effects of early maltreatment on several aspects of health across the lifespan. So this slide right here shows you, on the bottom here, we see the number of ACEs that people had, and the more that you have, your risk for things like mood disorders or depression, anxiety, substance abuse, impulse control increases exponentially. So look at this, 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, the prevalence of an anxiety disorder would be 70% in that population during adulthood. And the same findings, the same patterns we see for physical health as well. So that's things like heart disease, lung disease. These early childhood experiences are having a really lasting effect. And not only are they affecting health, but there's economic costs associated with this. So here's an estimate from 2014, just looking at what would be the cost for all the first-time maltreatment victims. And they found that it totals out to about $5.9 trillion. And that's because if you look at the kids who are victims of child maltreatment, the things that happen are that they then need all these additional services in mental health, medical health, the child welfare system, increases risk for delinquency and involvement with the juvenile justice system. They have problems with educational attainment, and all of these things have very high costs associated with them. So what we need to do is prevent this giant downstream from happening and intervene as soon as we can. And so where I think is most effective to intervene is in secondary prevention. And secondary prevention refers to once a problem has occurred, so in families where we know that maltreatment has already happened, to work on providing services to those families and intervene as early as we can to prevent these long-term negative developmental trajectories, and also to prevent recurrence. And the reason this is such an important time to intervene is that risk for recurrence of maltreatment is extremely high in these families. So over 5 years, half of the families who have a substantiation for child maltreatment will have a recurrence. And the risk for that is highest in the very first year after the incident occurs. So we also know that recurrence is higher for families where the children are young. So we want to intervene early, not just in terms of child development, but also in terms of the timing of when child maltreatment first occurred. So if we can work with families soon after they're identified by the system, then I think we're most likely to have the largest effects. And then in terms of what should we do, we should be addressing the parent-child relationship in secondary prevention. So as I mentioned before, child maltreatment most often occurs in that parent-child relationship. And so by definition, some people call maltreatment a pathogenic relationship. There's a problem in there between the parents and the children. We know that more than 90% of kids are victimized by their parents. And then when we look at where they end up following their involvement in the child maltreatment system, 80% of children remain in parents' custody. And that's a good thing, especially if we can do things to bolster that relationship and prevent future maltreatment. We also know that positive parenting can have a really strong buffering effect against the negative effects of maltreatment on subsequent development. And so we really want to intervene early. We can think about development as hierarchically organized, and there's certain stage salient tasks that kids need to accomplish as they grow. And so having a secure parent-child relationship is one of the earliest, most important developmental achievements. And from there on out, the achievement of all the next developmental milestones becomes easier if you have that important foundation. And so in intervening early, we actually do have some pretty good treatments available for working with families with infants or toddlers. But there's very, very little research focused specifically on that preschool age range when we know there's such a high risk for maltreatment occurring. So this is where my research has been focused, thinking about how can we translate our research on what we know are protective factors into effective interventions for child abuse and neglect. So as I said, a positive parental relationship is a major protective factor. And one important aspect of that parent-child relationship is communication. And this is especially relevant when we're talking about the preschool years. When we think about sensitive caregiving during infancy, that involves a lot of sensitive touch, proximity, holding. But as kids get older and their verbal skills are developing, parent-child communication becomes an extremely important arena for sensitive caregiving. And so a hypothesis of mine has been that if we can train parents of maltreating children to improve their communication, that could be a really effective focus of interventions. So one specific aspect of parent-child communication is parent-child reminiscing. So that's how parents talk with kids about past events. And we know that there's a lot of individual differences in how parents do this naturally. Some parents are really, really high in elaboration. So we say they have a high elaborative style. And these are parents who will ask lots of open-ended questions. We call them WH questions. They'll say, who was there, and what happened, and where were you? And if the child doesn't know, they'll fill in additional details. When the child says something, they'll say, yes, that's right, and this is what happened next. So they're confirming their child's contributions. And this high elaborative style has been shown to be related to a lot of important achievements. And so before I discuss that, I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about when I say mother-child reminiscing. Hey, Jack, do you remember yesterday when we went to go play downstairs in the basement? What did we go down there to do?
To things.
Yeah, we went to play with things. Did we build something? Do you remember what we built? What did we build?
Sonoma.
Sonoma. What's Sonoma?
A racetrack.
A racetrack. What shape is it?
I don't know.
It's not a regular shape, is it? Does it look like an oval?
No.
No. It's not all squiggly. Who else came downstairs with us when we were building the racetrack?
Lily.
Lily, that's right. So we got the whole track together, and then after you were having fun playing with it, you wanted to take something else out. What else did you want to play with? You wanted to play with checkers. Do you remember what I said?
No.
No, I didn't want you to play with the checkers. Why not?
Because he said no, and I was playing with them.
Yeah, you really wanted to play with them, but I said no because Lily might choke on them, huh? So then I gave you two options. I said I could take Lily upstairs and you could play with the checkers downstairs, or we could put the checkers away. And which one did you choose? What did you want to do?
Playing with Lily upstairs.
Yeah, you told me and Lily to go upstairs. So we went upstairs, but then how did you feel? Yeah, you were really sad.
And I didn't want it to be alone.
Yeah, you felt sad. I could see that because you didn't want to be by yourself. I knew you were sad because you started crying.
Did you hear it?
I did hear it. So then I went back down to get you, and you came upstairs. And what did we do to help you feel better?
What else?
Well, before we went back downstairs, first I gave you a really big hug, and then we decided to go find somebody else. Who else did we go find?
Daddy.
We found Daddy so that one of us could play with you and one of us could play with Lily. And I think Daddy and you went somewhere special. What'd you guys go do?
Go to the car wash.
You took a ride in the car and you got the car washed. Did you feel better by the time you were done with all that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see that I was trying my best in that conversation to ask tons and tons of open-ended questions. When he gave a response, I said like yes, and then what? Or if he didn't know the answer, I just filled in the details. And so that high elaboration is associated with better language and memory. So it's giving kids an opportunity to practice language. They're rehearsing memories and past shared events, and talking about it in this narrative helps organize that within kids' autobiography. But there's another aspect of that conversation that you might have noticed, and that has to do with the quality of the discussion. So, if you're reminiscing about past emotional events, then, the extent to which the parent can be emotionally supportive and tell a coherent story about what happened and try to talk about, well, how did you feel better? First, how did you identify, how were you feeling? And then what did we do to help you feel better from that? And the elaborative quality of these past event conversations has been linked to more positive representations of the self. It's also related to the parent-child relationship and more secure parent-child relationships. And it's also linked to emotion socialization. It's a really important piece of how we teach kids about their feelings. So, parents have a really important job of scaffolding how children's emotional development occurs. And so, when children are infants, parents are there to soothe them when they're crying and upset. But then as they get older, their job becomes a little more complicated in terms of helping kids understand what they're feeling. How can they label their feelings? They're teaching them how you can express emotions appropriately and how to cope with those emotions. And so some of that is achieved through modeling behavior. But another important piece of that is being able to talk with kids about their feelings, especially events that happened already, because it gives you a chance to talk about them when everybody's not super upset. So when the child's not upset in the moment, or even the caregiver when they're not really upset about something that has happened.
And there's lots of reasons to think that maltreating parents are not going to be good at these reminiscing skills. So some work that I had done looking at moms with infants in maltreating and non-maltreating families showed that maltreating moms just talk less to their infants. And then when we look at some school-age kids, we see that maltreating moms are less likely to talk about emotions with their children, and especially they avoid negative emotions. And those are really the ones that are the most important to be able to discuss, because we need to help kids understand what to do with those negative emotions and how to cope with them in appropriate ways. So a major hypothesis of my work has been that one reason that maltreatment is related to these negative outcomes is because maltreating parents are not good at this emotional communication. And then if this is true, then maybe we can improve emotional communication as an effective intervention strategy. So first I needed to test the hypothesis, just is maltreatment related to these negative outcomes through poor emotional communication? And I won't take you through all the details and methods of this study, but yes, the answer is maternal elaborative reminiscing is one way that we understand how maltreatment relates to kids' cognitive, emotional, and also physiological functioning in terms of their stress physiology. So then next, can we target that? Can we do this in an intervention, improve mom's ability to be emotionally supportive and elaborative during reminiscing? And so, we launched a project. First, we did a small pilot study testing this out, and then we received funding to look at this on a large scale. I designed a brief in-home intervention to improve maltreating parents' emotional communication skills. So it's done in-home. We have 240 participants in the study. 160 of them are maltreating. And we recruited them right from our local Department of Child Services and then also from the community. And then all of our parents have signed waivers to allow us to look at their records, so we make sure that they do have a history of child maltreatment or that there's an absence of child maltreatment to be in one of our comparison conditions. And so in order to be in the study, the maltreatment either had to be substantiated or we needed to know that there was no maltreatment. All of these families had children who were 3 to 6 years old, and the child needed to be living at home with the caregiver in order to participate in the study. So they could have previously been in foster care and have since been returned home, but in order to be able to practice these skills and work on them, they needed to be currently home with their caregiver. So this is just the basic design. So we have 160 maltreating families, and they're randomly assigned to either receive the intervention, which is officially called Reminiscing and Emotion Training, although you see in my previous slide, we call it the Heart-to-Heart Project because nobody likes reminiscing and emotion training. They would rather talk about having heart-to-heart conversations with their kids. So they're either randomized to this condition or to a control condition where we just help do a little additional case management. And then we also have non-maltreating families in the sample, because what we want to be able to see over time is each point at baseline, at 8 weeks, at 6 months, and 1 year, they come in for an assessment both in their homes and in the lab. And over time, we want to know if the intervention is improving these kids' functioning compared to the maltreatment control group, and also if it's approximating the functioning of these non-maltreated children who are demographically similar. So in the intervention itself, we focus on teaching 3 basic skills. We call it the ABCs of reminiscing. We want them to ask more open-ended questions, to be able to build on their child's responses, and then to communicate about feelings. So that's including both identifying and explaining feelings, and then a big emphasis on how we resolve negative feelings. And we do this through teaching the caregiver these 3 primary skills in home. There's 6 weekly visits, about an hour each. All the families watch a training video talking about the different skills. And then in every session, we practice. The mom practices with her child, and then we also videotape her practicing and immediately view that with the mom. And the goal for that is to help the mom identify what are the moments that are going really, really well. And we highlight those and encourage mom to keep working on those positive moments. And we're intentionally really focused on positive reinforcement and not in being critical of things they might not be doing. And then another important thing that we've integrated into this is some emotion development activities. So we know that maltreating families have a lot of difficulty identifying emotions and thinking about how to cope with negative emotions. So we have some simple activities like this one here. Our first activity is just, how does it look when you feel happy? How does it look when you feel scared? And they play a game with each other in the mirror to show their different feeling faces. And then in between the sessions, we ask them to practice, we ask them to practice every day, but we would like them to just record one practice between the two of them, and then we go over that at the start of the next session. And then lastly, we provide families with cell phones for the duration of the intervention, and that serves a couple of purposes. It helps us keep in touch with them, but it also gives us an opportunity to send some texts and remind them about the key things that we're working on each week in the intervention. So it's kind of like a little booster. So this is just an example of the content. I already explained the ABCs of Heart to Heart, but sort of what some of our practice guide and information sheets look like. And again, this big emphasis on communicating feelings. And then, so this is the content. I also want to talk a little bit more about the process of the intervention, and that is just that it's so critical to engage maltreating parents. This is not a population that is typically treatment seeking. So somebody else has come in and said you're not doing something appropriately. And so they're not necessarily always eager to receive treatment, but pretty much everybody can get on board with the idea of wanting to be able to communicate with their kids a little bit better. And we work hard to provide social support to these parents, and this is the reason we really focus on the positive feedback and highlighting things that they do well rather than giving direct negative feedback, because this is a group of individuals who already feel pretty badly about their parenting skills, and we're trying to help bolster their confidence and bolster their skills with avoiding criticism. It's also important for our staff, so we have 3 family coaches that have been providing this intervention in-home, and an important piece of this is for them to remain engaged and stay positive and to continually stay welcoming. So it has been an important thing for us to realize that maltreating parents sort of by definition have trouble with relationships, and so we need to go in with the expectation that there's probably going to be some difficulties in this therapeutic relationship as well, but we need to continue to remain open and positive, and then also to celebrate all of the successes. So one of the things that we have in our lab when they finish the intervention at the 1-year final visit, we have a little photo booth, and families really enjoy this, taking pictures, and we frame that for them to celebrate how far they've come in the project. So has this worked? I'm going to show you a little bit of our data. We're not totally finished collecting all of our data points along the way, but this one shows you here if we've improved mom's ability to be elaborative at post-test. So our intervention group is the one all the way on the left here, the RET condition. The middle one is our maltreatment comparison, and then the last one is our non-maltreatment group. And you can see for all of these skills, asking more WH questions, elaborating more, confirming their child's responses, the intervention group is doing this more than the other groups, controlling for how they did at baseline. And in many cases, they're also doing better than the non-maltreating group, actually. The same is true if we look at sort of the emotional types of elaboration. So asking emotion questions, being able to say, I think you were feeling sad, or I think you were angry. And then also being able to provide resolutions, because we don't want families to bring up emotional experiences and then not provide a resolution. It's not useful to say, like, remember that time you were super angry and here's all the things you did wrong? That's not ideal. They need to follow that up with being able to talk about how the child felt better and how that event came to a resolution. So we're seeing really positive effects there. And then I talked about the quality. We're also seeing some big improvements in elaborative quality. So I'll just highlight these here. This one's involvement and reciprocity. So being open and having a good dialogue back and forth between the mom and the child, being able to close negative feelings. So that's, again, getting at that resolution piece, and being able to structure the conversation in a way that makes sense and is coherent. So for these quality things, we've been able to get the quality of our intervention group up as high as our non-maltreatment group, but better than the maltreatment comparison kids. Also looking out at our 6-month outcome data, we're hoping that improving these things is going to lead to downstream positive effects for both the mother and the child. And so we're seeing that there's a decrease in re-victimization in our families who received the intervention compared to those who didn't, a decrease in maternal depressive symptoms, and then an increase in child emotion regulation. So these are all, going the right way, all the things that we're hoping to see. And so, what we've learned so far is that we're able to, improve multiple aspects of maternal reminiscing. We're improving that communication. The intervention actually seems to be pretty feasible, so we haven't lost that many families along the way. And this is a population of people where you tend to have a lot of attrition and people dropping out. But we only have lost about 8%. It seems to be associated with less re-victimization. And so what we're looking towards now is, what are the long-term benefits to this? And then what are the mechanisms that explain that? So, as we have the rest of our randomized clinical trial data available, it'll really be important in helping us understand those things. And then if it is as good as it seems right now, then we can think about how do we disseminate this intervention? How can we make a broader impact in the community or nationally? This is an intervention that is delivered by just bachelor's level clinicians, and it's pretty brief. So in that sense, it could be pretty cost effective and more easily disseminated than some other traditional treatment models. So here's what one of our moms have said that they learned from the intervention.
But just, how did you feel, or what did you feel about the project? Or
I'm glad I participated in it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like because of
What
that,
are you
I have
doing
better
in it?
communication with my children, and I'm able to kind of get what they feel out of it a little bit better. And I'm glad to kind of realize that I never really thought about the fact that I have to give them the language to be able to communicate how they feel. I just, it never occurred to me that I had to kind of show them and guide them how to communicate their feelings.
okay, did you feel it was too much? How about the project as far as being involved in the project? How did you feel on your involvement? Was it too many visits? What did you feel?
No, I didn't feel like it flew by really fast. The schedule was really, you work really good with my schedule and everything like that. Even with me having all the kids here, when I felt like I needed help, you brought in somebody to take the kids and occupy them. I felt like it went really well.
Okay, and do you think this is a skill that you'll probably be able to use with your children, continue using?
Oh yeah, definitely. I actually use it with all of my children, not just Kevin. I'm using it with all my kids to try to get them to label their feelings, because especially my 3-year-old, he had a lot of rage and he would fight a lot, and through this program, I figured out a lot of it was basically him not being able to communicate what his problem was or what kind of situation it is. And now I see him opening up and kind of blossoming and telling me, okay, she did this. This makes me mad. And him saying things like, this is frustrating at 3 years old is like really, really amazing to me. And we use the pictures even to identify exactly what kind of face they might have. They only really identify like angry or sad or something like that. But at least they do identify it.
Okay.
Okay, hold on, Kevin. Hold on.
All right. Are you going to say
Just a
anything,
couple of
Kevin?
questions, okay?
How did you like it, Kevin?
How did you like Miss Rose come over?
Good.
Yeah. How did you like talking?
Good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. What did you like best about me coming?
I don't know yet.
You don't know yet? Did you like your book and the stickers?
Yeah.
Good. And you're such a good drawer. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you.
All right. So, in addition to focusing on addressing child maltreatment in my research, I've also reflected a lot about my role as a professor here and the opportunities here at Notre Dame, whose mission fits so well with this work. So I realized that there's really an opportunity to engage the next generation of leaders in the field who are going to try to address child maltreatment. So I developed a course called Practicum in Child Maltreatment. It's for upper level psych majors, and the seminar portion of it is focused on didactics around learning about the child welfare system, research on how abuse and neglect affects development, and foster care. and the effects of that on child development. But the main learning, I think, in this class actually happens in the community-based practicum piece. So it's a community-based learning course, and we pair each of the students with children in foster care, and their job is to be a mentor for them in their homes or out in the community, about 2 times a week. And the reason that I've focused on that in both foster care and this mentorship model is that, my research is addressing kids who are still at home with their families or have been returned to their families. But what about the kids who are older and are not returning to their families anytime soon? What can we do for them? And the research really seems to indicate that having a positive adult relationship can make a huge difference. And so Notre Dame students are providing this really important mentorship to kids in foster care. They're being that adult support who are maybe making a huge difference for them and learning about child maltreatment along the way. So we've had about 50 kids be mentored through this program in the past, and we've been lucky to have funding from the Teaching Beyond the Classroom grants through the College of Arts and Letters. And with this grant, I'm able to give all the students in the class a stipend to spend on their students. So it's not much, but it allows them to take them out to eat or take them to fun activities. And then we usually end with a fun party on campus at the stadium where they get to go to the press box and go out on the field and get a tour. And it's a good way to celebrate all the relationships that have been developed across the semester. So lastly, I wanted to touch on what can you do? Hopefully you're fired up about child maltreatment now and want to do something about it. So first I wanted to point out that in Indiana, everybody is a mandated reporter. So in some states, just people who are in certain professional roles like teachers and physicians are mandated reporters. But here in Indiana, everybody is mandated if you suspect child abuse and neglect to call the hotline. And there's multiple ways that you could consider volunteering your time. You could be a mentor. You could volunteer at a Big Brothers, Big Sisters type organization. You could also think about becoming a CASA volunteer, so that stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate, and you would receive training, and then ultimately what that person does, in addition to being a mentor to a young child, is to be the voice for that child in court. So when they go make decisions about should this child be placed home, should they go to a group home, what do you think? You would be there to represent their best interests. If you're local, you could do things like support Roof Sit, all the proceeds from that U93 does every summer. They have a week-long fundraiser that all goes to prevent child abuse, St. Joe County. That money is spent right here in our county. Or you could do something as simple as letting your local government representatives know you care about issues like this. So with that, I wanted to acknowledge the Shaw Center, the Department of Child Services, who've been really critical in allowing me access to these populations for research, but also for my course. And to thank all the family coaches and collaborators and all of the individuals in my lab who've helped do all this important work. Special thanks to all the kids and families who make this possible, including my own. And I just wanted to end by saying, go Irish. All right. So questions?
Well, I kind of lost track of when you were doing the comparisons of the 3 different groups. It was hard to remember what each of those groups meant.
Okay.
The letters.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically across all of the findings that I showed, the intervention group learned all the skills that we were trying to teach them. So they were more elaborative, they asked more open-ended questions, they were able to resolve kids' emotions. So if we looked at both the quantity and the quality of how they reminisced, we were improving all of that relative to the non-maltreated kids and the maltreated kids as well. So we were expecting that they would be better than the maltreated families, but we didn't always expect that they would also be better than the non-maltreating families. So something that was a little bit surprising in some of our research was how little families talked about emotions across all the groups without intervention, and how even in our maltreatment group, there was pretty minimal discussion of emotions and how to resolve them.
Does faith make any difference, or were you able to look at that element of the families?
I don't have any formal assessment of faith and how that plays a role, but I do happen to know that one of our family coaches who delivers the intervention also is in a leadership role at one of our local churches, and she's been great at helping families find this project and enroll. And so I don't have a good measure of faith, but that's something that many success stories and families will say that was one of the protective factors that has helped them.
These children who are mistreated or abused, as they get, I'm very grateful that now it's becoming more known, but the generation before this generation, it went unrecorded. Mm-hmm. And these children just had to live in secrecy because they were afraid to tell anybody. And it seems like the people around knew about it, but was in total denial. Could that be a reason? They shudder at it because could be a denial thing. They're ashamed of bringing it up. And
yeah, I think it's a pretty complicated issue. It starts to get at also issues of like, what's the role of government in people's family, and can the government go into a family and say, I can take your child away? And so that's a very delicate issue, and I think we have some clear guidelines that if the child's safety is at risk, then that's when we can go in. But people feel very protective about that, and so it's hard to report. And certainly, different cultures are more or less willing to report. And and you even see different trends across different states. Like the state of Pennsylvania, if you look at their rates of child maltreatment, it's very, very low. But when you also look at the numbers of reports being called in, it's extremely low. So it's not that maltreatment's not happening there. People are not reporting it as well.
I don't normally ask questions of Saturday Scholars, but I'm surprised, and I don't know why I'm surprised, that Indiana should score so badly to be the 5th worst state. And I just wonder if there's any indication in your researches, I know it's not a primary area of your research, as to why Indiana should be one of the worst states.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. We're an interesting state in terms of like having a lot of rural areas and then some more densely populated urban areas, but I don't know. I wish I had the answer because we would go straight to that to try to correct it. I know a huge increase recently in terms of our numbers of maltreatment has been because of the opioid crisis. And there's many, many more children entering the system now because their parents are addicted, have overdosed in front of the children, are selling in front of the children, and often that happens in front of very young children. And so the average age of kids entering foster care has also been going down because there's so many young children exposed to that in particular. Another thing that might also be part of our numbers is that in Indiana, the laws changed a few years ago to consider domestic violence in front of children to be a felony, and also now requires a call to DCS. So I don't understand how before an officer could go to a situation where there's domestic violence in front of kids and it not have been required to call DCS, but now it's explicit that, so we see a lot of domestic violence as well.
What's the correlation between maltreated or neglected parents and their children?
There's very, very high rates of intergenerational transmission. So, we know that more often than not, parents do not perpetuate that transmission, but the single greatest risk factor for child maltreatment is parents' own history.
was going to say, this heart-to-heart program, are you doing that in people's homes, or are they coming like to campus or someplace centrally where you're kind of teaching?
Yeah, we do the actual intervention sessions in families' homes. So we go to them, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for them to actually receive the treatment. So when we're assessing them at, before and after, we do ask that they come to the lab for that, just because there's some things that we want to make sure that we have the same for everybody and that it's a distraction-free environment for some of our tasks and things like that. But for the intervention itself, we go to the families and we work really hard with them to try to, work around their schedules, so we don't always have a set appointment time. And that's part of the reason it's helpful to give them cell phones, because then we're able to have better communication around what's going to work and what isn't.
If those communication skills are important for development, and we're talking about applying them or using them, making intervention for maltreatment, but what about just having it be part of early childhood, family education? It would be broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all parents could benefit from some of these skills. I benefit from thinking about it from time to time, because it's always good to go back and reflect on the strategies that you're using with kids. And I think the training about it being useful to talk with kids about past emotional events after it's happened is very, very helpful, because there are many kids who, when they're all worked up and upset about a situation, that's not the time to talk with them or for them to process what happened or how we could prevent that in the future. And the same goes for parents too. I mean, because a lot of situations where parents and children get upset, the parents upset also. So these past event discussions are an opportunity to kind of like go back, and now that everybody's calm, to think through like, how did you feel? How can we deal with that the next time you feel this way? What are some things that you can do? And so I do think it could be broadly appealing for all sorts of parent education.
I was surprised you didn't have any economic factors in this, but you were providing cell phones. It suggests that these are poor people.
Yeah, so I do have information on the demographics of the sample if you'd like to see what they look like. It's by and large a very low SES population, and we intentionally matched our non-maltreatment group to look a lot like our maltreatment group. We intentionally wanted them to not be different on anything except for maltreatment. So you could see, like, in terms of parent education, more than half the sample has just a high school diploma or less. Their income, about 40 to 50% of the sample makes $6,000 a year or less. So we're talking about a very low income, low educated sample. And the only thing that we weren't completely successful at matching families on is race. And that is for two reasons. One is that, so this is our intervention group and our maltreatment control group. So these were randomly assigned, and sometimes random assignment just doesn't work out. So we had a few more families in the maltreatment control group that were African American, but we also found this other category. I've collapsed over a bunch of things, and there were a number of Hispanic families initially that we enrolled into the community sample, and then we realized that nobody is reporting, I shouldn't say nobody, but there's very little reporting of child maltreatment within our Hispanic community in this area. And I think that has a lot to do with fear about documentation. And so within that community, we realized that we couldn't recruit quite enough Hispanic maltreated children. And that sort of tipped our ethnicity scales a little bit. But by and large, we're talking about a very low income group of people. Any other questions?
Well, let me thank Kristin enormously for this. I have to make a comment about that cute kid in the very first video who was clearly being maltreated and forced to undergo a conversation with his mother just so she could give the talk today. And I promise not to report that child to CPS.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Thanks.